Hello and welcome back to Sci-fi Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and continue creating these adventures for you. You can donate by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment below. They looked at his flat teeth and soft skin, and they saw nothing but prey. In a galaxy ruled by evolved apex predators and beings of pure energy, the Council of the Grand Archive had already decided humanity's fate, condemning them to eternal servitude as harmless, grass-eating cattle. They were 100% certain of their biological superiority. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them inside a dented tin lunchbox. The Grand Archive of the Galactic Alliance hung suspended in the dead center of a shattered nebula, surrounded by swirling clouds of violet gas and the fractured remnants of ancient stars. Inside the vast, cavernous amphitheater, the atmosphere was sterile, cold, and utterly devoid of anything as crude as biological necessity. The air smelled sharp, full of ozone and filtered perfection. The beings that filled the towering amphitheater tiers had long ago transcended the messy realities of flesh, blood, and dirt. Some existed purely as hovering geometric structures of hard light, while others were sleek, biomechanical entities that consumed ambient radiation for their daily sustenance. Today, they had gathered in their thousands to pass absolute judgment on the sovereignty of a primitive, watery rock known as Earth. At the very center of the executioner's floor sat Chandler Bone. He was a space engineer acting as Earth's incredibly reluctant diplomatic envoy. Amidst the blinding brilliance of floating data streams and pristine holographic projections, Chandler was a glaring, ugly anomaly. He wore an oil-stained, heavy canvas jumpsuit, heavily patched at the knees and elbows with thick, synthetic threading. His skin was deeply leathered from years of exposure to stellar radiation, marred by pale, jagged scars across his knuckles and along his jawline. While the alien delegates communicated through silent, telepathic waves and instantaneous data bursts, Chandler sat completely quiet, dragging a primitive stick of graphite across a pad of pressed tree pulp. The harsh, scratching sound of his pencil was the single organic noise echoing in the immense room. Above him loomed Professor Vial, a towering entity possessing 6 multi-jointed limbs and a head encased in a crystalline sensory dome. Vial was the foremost xenobiologist of the High Council, and right now, he was systematically dissecting humanity's right to exist as free beings. A massive, 3-dimensional projection of Chandler's internal anatomy rotated slowly in the center of the room, bathing the human in an icy blue light. "Observe the specimen," Vial announced. His voice translated into a flat, synthesized drone that echoed through the chamber with absolute authority. The human physiological structure is laughably fragile. Their dermal layer is practically non-existent, offering zero resistance to standard kinetic impact. Note the cranial structure and the oral cavity. They possess no elongated canines for tearing flesh, no venom sacs, no retractable claws, and absolutely no natural armor. Their digestive tract is alarmingly inefficient. The enormous hologram zoomed in tightly on the human jawbone, highlighting it in bright yellow. The dental formation is entirely flat, designed exclusively for mashing and grinding fibrous plant matter. By every known metric of universal taxonomy, the species known as humans are obligate herbivores. A wave of smug, pulsing light rippled through the audience, acting as their equivalent of arrogant, mocking laughter. Vial crossed his upper limbs, his sensory dome glowing with triumph. "It is the formal conclusion of this biological survey that Earth possesses absolutely zero natural predatory instinct. Therefore, allowing them to maintain any form of military fleet is a direct violation of the Natural Order Accords. I propose the immediate disarmament of the entire human species, They shall be permanently reclassified as a Tier 4 serf species, assigned to agricultural colonies where they can safely cultivate crops and serve the higher predatory and energy-based races of this glorious alliance. The murmurs of agreement from the council were deafening. Whispers of open contempt cascaded down from the glowing tiers, washing over the tiny human at the bottom of the pit. Yet, Chandler Bone did not object. He did not stand up. He did not slam his fists on the table, and he offered no passionate defense of his people. Instead, he simply stopped writing. He raised his left wrist, pulling back the frayed cuff of his sleeve to look at a battered analog watch. The second hand ticked away in the oppressive, heavy silence. He lowered his wrist, picked up his graphite pencil, and tapped the rubber eraser end against the cold steel of his desk. Tap, tap, tap. He was the very picture of an eerie, absolute calm. Vial looked down at him, his sensory dome flashing red, clearly irritated by the human's complete lack of submission or fear. "Do you have any final, futile arguments to present before the decree is sealed, human?" Before Chandler could even open his mouth to reply, a soft, melodic chime resonated through the entirety of the Grand Archive. It was the designated midday cycle transition, the galactic equivalent of a lunch bell. Chandler let out a long, heavy sigh that carried through the room's acoustic amplifiers. He dropped the pencil onto the paper and stretched his neck until the vertebrae popped loudly. "No, Professor," Chandler said, his voice deep, raspy, and completely unbothered. "I think I have heard exactly enough of your theories for one morning." The intermission protocol initiated with a soft, harmonic frequency that bathed the chamber in a soothing ultraviolet glow. Immediately, the grand amphitheater settled into a state of absolute, reverent silence. For the highly evolved delegates of the Galactic Alliance, the concept of a meal was a pristine, frictionless transaction of energy. Across the soaring tiers, beings of pure, hard light dimmed their outer edges to absorb ambient, high-frequency lumens directly from the ceiling arrays. The biomechanical entities, sleek and metallic, connected themselves to microscopic capillary tubes, silently siphoning odorless, translucent nutrient gels that required zero chewing or digestion. Others merely unfurled gossamer thin membranes to bask in synthesized photosynthetic gases. There was no chewing, no swallowing, no mess. The entire chamber was a vacuum of biological noise, a sanctuary of sterile, supreme evolution. Down in the center pit, Chandler shifted in his seat. The heavy, synthetic fabric of his suit rustled loudly, a coarse sound that drew the judgmental, glowing optics of several nearby delegates. He ignored them. Reaching down beneath his steel desk, his large, calloused hands grasped the thick handle of a heavy, lead-lined metal box. The casing was deeply scarred, dented at the corners, and completely out of place among the hovering, frictionless technology of the room. He hauled it up and set it squarely on the desk with a heavy thud that vibrated through the floor plates. Slowly, deliberately, Chandler rested his hands on the dual steel latches. He flicked the first one up. A sharp, violent clack echoed through the amphitheater, as loud as a gunshot in the pristine silence. He flicked the second latch. Another harsh, metallic crack. Chandler pushed the heavy lid open. Inside, wrapped tightly in a layer of thermal foil, was a massive, 2-pound slab of bone in ribeye steak. It had been seared over an open flame just before he boarded his transport, cooked strictly to a dripping rare. As Chandler peeled back the foil, a thick plume of trapped heat and vapor billowed upward, instantly caught by the amphitheater's hypersensitive atmospheric circulation fans. The sterile perfection of the room was violently shattered. The heavy, aggressive scent of charred animal fat, smoked hickory wood, cracked black peppercorns, and roasted garlic exploded into the air currents. But beneath the spices lay something far more primitive, a smell completely alien to the herbivores and energy beings of the council. It was the sharp, metallic, unmistakable tang of raw myoglobin. The smell of blood. The scent crashed over the front rows like a physical shockwave. Several telepathic delegates immediately severed their mental connections, physically recoiling in their hovering pods. The air purifiers whined in protest, their intake valves struggling and failing to scrub the heavy, dense molecules of cooked flesh from the environment. Chandler reached into his deep side pocket and pulled out a heavy, carbon steel survival knife. The serrated blade caught the cold blue light of the room. He grabbed a simple steel fork, drove it mercilessly into the center of the meat, and began to saw. The harsh, grating friction of the steel blade scraping against the bottom of the tin box set dozens of alien auditory sensors into a state of painful distress. He carved off a thick, generous chunk of the ribeye. The outer crust was blackened and caramelized, but the inside was bright, weeping crimson. Dark red juices pooled at the bottom of the tin, staining the foil. Chandler raised the dripping piece of muscle tissue to his mouth, closed his lips around it, and pulled it off the steel tines. Then the human began to chew. In the dead silence of the hall, the acoustic amplifiers meant to capture whispered diplomacy instead picked up the wet, heavy sounds of human mastication. The sickening tear of muscle fibers. The wet squelch of rare meat being crushed. The sharp crackle of a piece of rendered fat popping between flat, blunt molars. Chandler closed his eyes, letting out a low, satisfied groan of pure culinary enjoyment, completely oblivious to the cosmic horror unfolding around him. Absolute, unadulterated pandemonium erupted. To the Galactic Alliance, the consumption of another creature's actual flesh was a myth, a nightmare reserved only for the mindless, cosmic horrors that lurked in the uncharted black zones of deep space. Seeing a designated herbivore casually ripping into a bloody corpse caused a catastrophic biological meltdown. In the second tier, a tall, avian delegate violently expelled bright yellow stomach fluids all over its pristine control console. 3 light beings in the eastern sector flickered wildly before entirely collapsing into unconsciousness, their projectors short-circuiting from pure psychological trauma. A cacophony of shrieks, gurgles, and panicked frequencies filled the air. High above, Professor Vale stumbled backward away from his podium. His 6 multi-jointed limbs shook uncontrollably, his crystalline sensory dome fogging over with condensation from his rapid, panicked breathing. He stared at the human, his optical sensors locking onto the dark red fluid smeared across Chandler's chin. Suddenly, the amphitheater was bathed in strobing crimson light. The deafening, pulsating wail of the facility's highest-tier biological hazard siren began to scream from the walls, signaling a lethal contamination event. Amidst the flashing red lights, the vomiting aliens, and the shrieking alarms, Chandler Bone swallowed his mouthful of steak. He set his knife down, reached into the box, and retrieved a plain, white paper napkin. He calmly wiped the blood and grease from the corners of his mouth, crumpled the napkin, and tossed it onto the desk. He leaned back in his chair, looked up at the trembling, horrified Professor Vile, and raised a single eyebrow. Has the professor never seen anyone eat lunch before? The blaring crimson lights of the hazard sirens abruptly cut off, replaced by the humming surge of a high-density kinetic containment field. A thick, shimmering dome of violent purple energy slammed down around Chandler, sealing his desk inside a localized vacuum. High above the floor, Professor Vale had scrambled backward to the emergency override console, frantically slamming his multi-jointed manipulators against the glowing interface. "Containment established!" Vile shrieked, his translated voice cracking with digital static and pure panic. "By the authority of the High Council, I declare this entity a necrotic anomaly. It is consuming the decaying flesh of a deceased biological organism. This is a behavior observed exclusively in mindless cosmic aberrations residing in the dead zones of the universe. The human is not an herbivore. It is a biological weapon." Chandler did not flinch when the energy field sparked mere inches from his face. He remained seated, wiping a final smudge of grease from his chin with the back of his thumb. He looked up at the panicked alien scholar with a gaze as hard and cold as a dying star. "It is called a cow, Professor," Chandler said, his voice easily cutting through the containment field's audio relays. "And this is called lunch. We did not wait for the universe to hand us our meals on a silver platter. You looked at our flat teeth and assumed we were prey. You forgot that, because we lacked natural armor and venom, we had to use our brains and our fire to forge our own place at the top of the food chain. We breed these animals, we raise them, we butcher them, and we cook them over an open flame. It is called agriculture and the culinary arts." If Chandler thought his explanation would calm the room, he was drastically mistaken. A wave of profound, existential horror washed over the Grand Archive. The telepathic network buzzed with the equivalent of manic, terrified screaming. "You breed them," hissed a multi-eyed delegate from the upper tiers, its voice trembling with raw revulsion. "You systematically generate life solely for the purpose of slaughter and consumption. You orchestrate mass, industrialized murder for sustenance. You corral lesser beings, nurture them, only to sever their life functions when their muscle mass reaches optimal density?" "Yes," Chandler replied, his tone entirely conversational. "Though we usually add a bit of rosemary and black pepper to enhance the flavor." The sheer nonchalance of his response broke the minds of half the assembly. Vale gripped the edges of his podium, his crystalline dome flashing with erratic, terrified patterns. The initial mockery had vanished entirely, replaced by a deep, instinctual dread. The realization hit the council like a physical blow. The humans were not weak, helpless herbivores. They were something far worse. They were apex predators masking themselves in the fragile bodies of prey. They were calculated, systematic, and entirely ruthless. They possessed a psychopathic dominance that defied every known law of biological evolution. "This is an absolute abomination," Vile declared, his voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper that echoed across the vast chamber. "A physically weak species that bends the natural order to simulate predatory dominance is a cancer upon the galaxy. I am immediately overturning my initial verdict. The species known as humanity is hereby reclassified as a Level 9 biological threat. Your very existence is a psychological contagion. You must be purged before this industrialized violence spreads to the civilized sectors of our galactic alliance." The council erupted into frantic agreements, desperate to erase the terrifying reality sitting before them. But even in their blind panic, bureaucratic protocol held absolute power. Vile could not simply execute a diplomatic envoy without a sanctioned trial by combat, a dark remnant of the ancient treaties that formed their society. "To authorize the immediate planetary sterilization of Earth, I invoke the law of survival," Vile proclaimed, pointing a trembling limb at the containment dome. "You claim your species uses intelligence to conquer nature? Let us test that delusion. You will be dropped into the emergency simulation arena. You will face a true galactic apex predator. When it rips you apart, the Council will have the legal precedent required to classify your kind as an evolutionary failure, justifying the total annihilation of your world." The threat hung heavy in the air, designed to break the human spirit, to make him fall to his knees and beg for mercy. Instead, Chandler simply looked down at the half-eaten ribeye, sitting in its pool of red juices. "A real shame," Chandler muttered under his breath. "It was cooked perfectly." He reached forward and closed the lid of the dented tin box. The sharp snap of the metal latches echoed ominously over the breathless audio feed. Chandler picked up his lunchbox, stood up from his chair, and casually brushed a stray crumb off his heavy canvas jumpsuit. He stared directly into Vale's glowing optical sensors, his expression entirely devoid of fear. "Well," Chandler said, gesturing toward the containment field with a slight nod of his head. "Drop the shield, Professor. Open the arena." The transition was instantaneous and brutal. A blinding flash of white light scorched Chandler's retinas, and a fraction of a second later, He was violently slammed into the damp, rotting soil of a primordial jungle. The air was thick, choking him with unnatural humidity and the suffocating smell of decaying vegetation. But the most immediate, terrifying threat was the crushing physical weight. The simulation parameters had been dialed up to exactly 1.5 times standard Earth gravity. Every single movement felt like he was dragging heavy iron chains, his own skeleton fighting against the oppressive downward pull. Chandler pushed himself up to his hands and knees, his breath coming in ragged, labored gasps. He quickly patted himself down to take inventory. His communications unit was gone. His diagnostic scanner was missing. The automated system had stripped him of everything except his heavily patched canvas jumpsuit, his carbon steel survival knife, and the dented tin lunchbox he still gripped tightly in his left hand. High above the dense, synthetic canopy, Professor Vile's voice boomed from hidden atmospheric speakers, ringing out with cold, mechanical cruelty. Entity designated human. You face the Vexil. It is a biological apex predator responsible for the total extinction of 3 distinct, lower-tier civilizations. It possesses naturally occurring ablative nanoscales, rendering it entirely impervious to standard kinetic impact. Its biological neurotoxin causes total nervous system failure in under 10 seconds. Most importantly, it hunts perfectly unseen. Your termination will be broadcast to the entire archive to serve as legal precedent for your species' eradication. Chandler did not waste his breath shouting at the sky. He scrambled to his feet and began to sprint. He crashed blindly through the dense undergrowth, his heavy work boots snapping dry branches and churning up the black, foul-smelling mud. To the thousands of alien spectators watching the massive holographic screens back in the pristine Grand Archive, the human looked exactly like the perfect, panicked prey they assumed he was. He was stumbling, breathing heavily, and leaving a massive, clumsy trail of broken ferns and disturbed earth. But beneath that outward display of blind panic, Chandler's mind was working with cold, ruthless, and mechanical precision. He was not merely fleeing. He was mapping the terrain. He was testing the artificial gravity, adjusting his stride and breathing to conserve maximum energy. And most importantly, he was watching the environment behind him with intense scrutiny. He noticed the anomaly after running for roughly 300 yards. There was a slight, unnatural distortion in the air behind him. It was a subtle warping of the light, exactly like heat shimmering off a blacktop highway on a scorching summer afternoon. The Vexil was bending the ambient light around its body, rendering its physical form virtually invisible. However, Chandler quickly realized the camouflage was not flawless. As the unseen creature moved rapidly through the dappled, inconsistent shadows of the dense jungle canopy, its biological matrix had to constantly recalculate the light refraction. There was a tiny fraction of a second of lag when it transitioned from deep shade into direct, bright light. A split second where the illusion rippled and broke. That was the flaw. That was all the leverage Chandler needed. Chandler veered sharply to the right, plunging himself deliberately into a dense thicket of thick, thorny vines. He intentionally caught his arm on a jagged barb, tearing a piece of his heavy canvas sleeve and leaving the fabric snagged as evidence. He scooped up a handful of wet mud and smeared it against a massive tree trunk, forging a highly visible false trail that led straight into a steep, dead-end ravine. Then, he doubled back. Moving with sudden, silent, predatory grace, he climbed up a sloping boulder overlooking a small, brightly sunlit clearing, keeping himself perfectly hidden in the shadows. Crouched silently behind the rock, Chandler opened his lunchbox. He carefully removed the half-eaten steak and set it aside on the stone. Taking his heavy survival knife, he wedged the thick carbon steel blade under the hinge of the tin lid and pried violently upward. With a sharp, ugly crack of tearing metal, the lid snapped completely off the box. The underside of the lid was unpainted, polished steel, making it a highly reflective surface. Next, Chandler reached into the bottom of the lunchbox and pulled out a small, crinkled plastic packet of ultra-hot habanero pepper sauce he had grabbed from the ship's commissary. He bit the top off the plastic packet and squeezed the thick, bright orange paste over the jagged, broken metal edge of the lunchbox hinge, coating the sharp steel thoroughly. He waited. His breathing slowed to a perfectly controlled rhythm. The artificial sun beat down fiercely directly onto the center of the clearing. Less than 2 minutes later, the broad leaves at the edge of the clearing began to rustle violently. There was no physical form to be seen, just a massive, localized distortion of the air sliding silently into the open space. The Vexil was tracking the fake scent trail exactly as Chandler had planned. The creature stepped directly out of the shadows and right into the center of the brilliant sunlight. Chandler stood up from behind the boulder. The sudden movement instantly drew the invisible monster's attention. The shimmering distortion whipped around to face him. In that exact fraction of a second, Chandler raised the polished steel lid of the lunchbox, angling it precisely with both hands. He caught the full, blinding glare of the artificial sun and bounced a concentrated beam of brilliant, searing light directly into the center of the shifting mass. The Vexil emitted a horrific, high-pitched, mechanical shriek. Its highly advanced optical sensors, which had been biologically dialed up to track prey in the darkest depths of the jungle, were instantly overwhelmed and burned by the focused solar glare. The active camouflage matrix shattered entirely, revealing the beast in all its horror. It was a massive, serpentine nightmare covered in shifting, gunmetal gray scales, boasting 4 muscular limbs and a jaw that unhinged like a snake, dripping with venom. It thrashed wildly, violently shaking its head, temporarily completely blind. Chandler did not hesitate for a microsecond. Utilizing the heavy gravity to accelerate his descent, he launched himself off the boulder, dropping directly toward the thrashing monster. He completely bypassed the impenetrable armored scales on its back. Instead, he slid beneath its wildly snapping jaws, driving his right arm upward with every ounce of kinetic force his body could generate. He slammed the jagged, hot sauce-coated metal hinge of the lunchbox directly into the soft, pink, unarmored sensory membrane located just beneath the creature's lower jaw. The sharp metal tore deep into the unprotected flesh. But the physical wound was secondary. The highly concentrated habanero extract flooded directly into the monster's delicate respiratory and sensory tissue. To an alien creature equipped with hypersensitive olfactory and taste receptors, capsaicin was a completely unknown, agonizing chemical weapon. The Vexil convulsed violently, spewing thick blue blood and acidic saliva into the dirt. It began screaming in pure, blinding agony as its internal sensory organs were engulfed in chemical fire, completely neutralizing its ability to fight or track. Back in the Grand Archive, the colossal amphitheater was trapped in a suffocating, terrifying silence. Thousands of elite alien delegates stared at the massive floating viewing screens, completely paralyzed by shock. They had fully expected a brutal massacre that would last less than 30 seconds. They had expected to see a fragile, soft-skinned herbivore ripped to shreds. Instead, they were watching a supposedly primitive, weak creature turn a discarded piece of food packaging and a primitive condiment into a devastating, calculated tactical strike. They were not watching a prey animal fight for its life. They were witnessing the terrifying rise of a tactical mind that viewed everything in the universe as a weapon. To the advanced minds of the Galactic Alliance, the concept of physical conflict was strictly binary. A biological entity either possessed the overwhelming physiological advantage to secure an immediate, decisive victory, or it utilized massive bursts of kinetic energy to flee and ensure survival. The Vexil, blinded and screaming in agonizing pain from the chemical burn of the habanero extract, chose the latter. It scrambled frantically away into the dense, suffocating undergrowth, leaving a highly visible trail of corrosive blue blood across the broad leaves. The completely logical, universally accepted response for a weaker, softer prey species was to hide. Chandler Bone was supposed to cower in the shadows, waiting out the simulation timer, while praying the monster succumb to its injuries. Chandler did not hide. He did not run. He simply picked up his heavy survival knife, adjusted his grip on the handle, and started walking. This was the absolute horror of human persistence hunting. It was a biological legacy forged on the ancient, scorching savannas of Earth. The Vexil would sprint for miles, tearing through the jungle at breakneck speeds, exhausting its anaerobic energy reserves. Then, it would collapse in the mud, panting heavily, desperate to lower its core body temperature and heal. But just as its accelerated heart rate began to settle, the human would appear through the distant foliage. Chandler was not charging. He was not shouting. He was just walking, step after step, two legs moving with a terrifying mechanical rhythm. Humans possess the unique ability to regulate their body temperature through sweat, allowing them to endure physical exertion for lengths of time that defied alien biological logic. For 3 continuous hours, Chandler tracked the apex predator. He pushed the massive beast far beyond its physical and psychological limits. The Vexil's advanced camouflage matrix failed completely, drained of all ambient energy. Its heavily muscled limbs trembled violently with lactic acid buildup. The psychological terror inflicted upon the thousands of alien delegates watching the colossal screens was absolute. They were witnessing a waking nightmare, a creature composed of fragile flesh, flat teeth, and 0 natural weapons was psychologically breaking the deadliest engineered assassin in the galaxy, simply by refusing to stop walking. High in the pristine archive, Professor Vale watched the telemetry data plummet with mounting horror. The Vexil was experiencing catastrophic systemic stress. Pure panic seized the High Scholar. This was completely impossible. The human was supposed to be dead within 10 seconds. If Chandler survived this trial, the entire foundation of the Galactic Alliance's biological hierarchy would collapse, and Vial would be ruined. Desperate, Vial slammed his multi-jointed manipulators across his command console. He deliberately bypassed the Council's strict oversight protocols and flooded the Vexil's internal neural implants with highly illegal, synthesized combat stimulants. He cranked its aggression parameters to absolute maximum capacity. Simultaneously, Vial hard-coded the simulation's emergency escape doors permanently shut. There would be no authorized extraction, only death. Down in the artificial jungle, the Vexil let out an ear-splitting roar. The massive chemical injection forced its exhausted, trembling muscles to bulge and spasm violently. It turned back toward the human, driven by an artificial, suicidal fury. Chandler sensed the sudden shift in the environment immediately. The hunted was coming back. He stopped walking. He quickly scanned his surroundings and found a narrow gorge flanked by towering, sheer rock faces. Moving rapidly, he gathered thick, synthetic jungle vines and located a massive, suspended stone slab, resting precariously on a high ridge. With practiced efficiency, he rigged a crude but devastating deadfall trap. But to make it work, he needed the enraged beast to commit entirely. He needed it completely blind to the danger above. Chandler took his heavy carbon steel blade, flipped it over, and pressed the razor-sharp edge directly against his own left forearm. With a quick, brutal motion, he dragged the steel across his skin. Bright, crimson blood welled up instantly, spilling over his scarred flesh and dripping into the dark soil. The heavy, metallic, unmistakable scent of fresh human blood hit the humid air currents. The Vexil, maddened by the stimulants and starving for vengeance, caught the scent. It abandoned all tactical stealth and charged blindly into the narrow gorge, its massive jaws snapping wildly. As the beast lunged forward, unhinging its jaw to deliver a fatal, venomous strike, Chandler calmly sidestepped. He swung his knife in a tight arc, severing the tension vine with a single, clean slash. The massive stone slab plummeted from the ridge above. It crashed down with earth-shattering force, crushing the Vexil's hindquarters and pinning the horrific monster violently to the ground. The beast shrieked, thrashing its heavily armored upper body wildly, its metallic scales scraping uselessly against the unyielding stone. The council held its collective breath. The thousands of delegates waited in terrified silence for the human to deliver the final, killing blow. They waited for a primitive execution. But Chandler did not stab the creature's brain. He knelt casually beside the thrashing, venom-spewing head, completely ignoring the lethal acid splashing mere inches from his face. He drove his bare hands directly into the open, bleeding wound beneath its jaw, intentionally bypassing the organic flesh to access the creature's cybernetic infrastructure. The Vexil was not just a biological terror. It was a heavily augmented warden of the simulation grid, containing a localized network routing node embedded deep in its upper spinal column. Chandler plunged his fingers into the thick blue gore and violently ripped out the neural biocore. It was a pulsing, metallic cylinder, slick with glowing alien fluids. What happened next permanently shattered the very sanity of the watching alien delegates. Chandler sat cross-legged in the mud, holding the highly advanced quantum processing core in his blood-soaked hands. He did not possess a decryption key. He did not have a sophisticated interface terminal or an override algorithm. He simply used the heavy tip of his survival knife to forcefully pry off the core's protective titanium casing. Then, using his thick, calloused bare fingers, he began physically snapping microscopic circuit pathways. He was forcibly rewiring the delicate quantum optical threads through sheer, brute force physical manipulation. Sparks flew as he crossed active data streams. He was hacking a Tier 1, secure military network by literally tearing its hardware apart and tying the glowing wires together like a pair of worn-out shoelaces. A deep, suffocating dread blanketed the Grand Archive. The alien delegates finally, truly understood the horrifying nature of humanity. The humans were not dangerous because they possessed immense physical strength, impenetrable armor, or lethal venom. They were a cosmic terror because of their ruthless, psychopathic adaptability. They were a species that could look at a terrifying apex predator and see nothing but spare parts. They could look at a lethal death trap and see a tool for victory. They bent the universe to their will, not through natural biological evolution, but through sheer, terrifying ingenuity. Inside the simulation, the artificial sky began to bleed. The massive holographic canopy flickered violently, tearing apart into cascading, corrupted streams of jagged green code. Chandler jammed two severed optical threads together, permanently closing the brutalized circuit. A massive, deafening shockwave of digital feedback shattered the entire virtual environment. The oppressive gravity vanished instantly. The suffocating humid air evaporated. The trees dissolved into a storm of broken polygons. The physical kinetic containment wall of the arena, a barrier designed to withstand direct orbital bombardment, simply ceased to exist under the catastrophic paradox of the overridden security codes. Through the smoke and collapsing data streams, a gaping, jagged portal opened directly back into the pristine, sterile center of the Grand Archive. The jagged tear in reality crackled with chaotic green energy, casting erratic shadows across the immaculate walls of the Grand Archive. From the swirling vortex of corrupted data, a lone figure emerged. Chandler Bone stepped back onto the executioner's floor. His heavy canvas jumpsuit was shredded, hanging in tatters across his broad shoulders. He was drenched in a horrific mixture of the monster's corrosive blue fluids and the bright, undeniable crimson of his own human blood. Every heavy footstep he took left a dark, staining footprint on the pristine, glowing floor plates of the Galactic Court. An absolute, suffocating silence fell over the colossal amphitheater. The thousands of elite beings, energy entities, and apex predators sat entirely paralyzed. They had witnessed a terrifying display of sheer, unadulterated willpower. The designated herbivore had completely shattered their reality. High above, Professor Vale's multi-jointed limbs gave way. The towering xenobiologist collapsed to his knees, his crystalline sensory dome flickering with a dull, terrified gray light. He cowered behind his podium, bracing his body for the brutal, vengeful massacre he was absolutely certain was coming. In the wild, when a predator is bested, the victor always slaughters the defeated to claim dominance. Chandler did not draw his weapon. He did not charge the podium. He simply walked back to his designated steel desk with a slow, agonizingly deliberate pace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the mangled, blood-soaked neural biocore of the Vexil. He dropped it onto the metal surface. The heavy thud echoed like a thunderclap in the silent room. Chandler looked up, his piercing gaze sweeping across the towering tiers of the panicked council. "You look at fangs and claws to gauge danger," Chandler declared, his raspy voice echoing through the massive chamber, without the need for any digital amplification. "But fangs are just instinct. Armor is just biology. Intellect and choice are what make a true ruler. We eat meat because we can, but we spare you because we choose to do so." The profound weight of his words slammed into the alien delegates. For 1,000,000 years, they had operated on strict biological determinism. The strong killed the weak. But this human was introducing a horrifyingly advanced concept: mercy. A mercy born not from weakness, but from absolute terrifying superiority. Chandler leaned forward, resting his bloody hands on the edge of the desk. He locked eyes with the trembling Professor Vale. "While I was manually rearranging the quantum threads of your pet monster's brain, I noticed a very interesting packet of command logs," Chandler said, his tone turning ice cold. "I saw the exact moment you illegally flooded the creature with combat stimulants. I saw the network registry where you manually locked the emergency exit doors. I have a complete, hard-coded backup of your little cheating scandal resting securely in my temporal drive." Vile let out a pathetic digital whimper. "Here is the deal, Professor," Chandler continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The High Council will immediately recognize Earth as an equal, sovereign power. You will drop all restrictions on our fleets and our planetary development. If you refuse, or if you even hesitate, I will broadcast this massive security flaw and the undeniable proof of your Supreme Council's blatant corruption to every enemy fleet lurking in the outer sectors. They will know exactly how to break your unbreakable arenas." It was a flawless political checkmate. Chandler had not just beaten their monster physically. He had systematically dismantled their entire political infrastructure. In a state of overwhelming awe and complete helplessness, the Supreme Council did not even debate. A synchronized chime echoed through the Grand Archive as the High Registry was instantly updated. All charges of biological terrorism were completely erased. Earth was granted supreme, undisputed autonomy. In the Grand Archives of Galactic Biology, the human species was permanently erased from the herbivore classification. In its place, glowing in harsh, warning red letters, was a new title: Apex Adapters. Chandler watched the holographic confirmation flash across his desk. The fate of his entire species had just been secured. The universe belonged to them now. He calmly reached out and picked up his dented tin lunchbox from the desk. He opened the jagged, broken lid and looked down at the half-eaten slab of meat resting inside. Chandler let out a heavy sigh and frowned in deep annoyance. "Damn it," Chandler muttered, shaking his head. "The steak got cold." Without another word, he turned his back on the highest governing body in the galaxy and walked slowly toward the exit, leaving an ancient alien empire forever changed by a single, terrifying lunch break. Thank you so very much for listening to today's story. We truly appreciate you spending your time with us here at Sci-fi Stories. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. We always love seeing how far our tales travel across the world. As we mentioned earlier, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the funds to operate. If you found today's story entertaining and want to help us out, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated team, helping them provide for their families, while continuing to create and bring these incredible sci-fi adventures directly to you. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next story.